The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus.
Before I was a diocesan priest, I was a third order Dominican, so I hope you came to Mass today wanting to hear about St. Thomas. So, what could I say that hasn't been said more beautifully, but my goodness, what a wonderful saint, and certainly one of my favorite saints. Let me just read from the Ordo that kind of summarizes daily Mass settings and things. It says, Thomas Aquinas, who died in 1274, called the angelic doctor, who wrote the Summa Theologiae and authored Adoro te devote o salutaris, tantum ergo and pange linguae, patron of Catholic schools, colleges, and universities, of philosophers, theologians, and booksellers. So kind of an interesting saint. That's quite a pedigree right there. And it does say quite a bit about St. Thomas that's important to realize. You know, we often have saints that, you know, we talk about one aspect of the saint or one little area of devotion or one really tight focus, and usually that saint had a very interesting life, had a real depth to their faith, a real depth to their influence and guidance of others to lead them to Christ, but we kind of tend to focus on one thing. That's really hard to do with St. Thomas. As it said, he died in 1274. I think he died just under at 49 or 50, so not even all that old. But he joined the Dominicans only after about 20 years of their being established, and he was really seen as kind of a radical for doing that. It kind of makes me laugh now, a radical Dominican. So, but at the same time, that's what he was seen. How could you do that? But he desired to be a theologian, somebody who really studied the study of God, the study of godly things, because he wanted to be a better preacher, and he certainly accomplished both those things. You know, he became a university professor in Paris, and at the time, that was the premier place to be. That was the premier job to be if you were an intellectual in the Middle Ages in his time, and certainly in the West. And so he was no slouch as far as intellectual. He wrote over 100 books, many of them not fair to call a book. One of them, the Summa, well, there's multiple Summas, but the one that he mainly wrote, this is just one of 5 volumes that he has, one of my cherished possessions, having the full 5-volume set. So saying 100 books doesn't really kind of cover what he wrote. But he was an intellectual, but passionately devout. As you heard in the Ordo, he wrote these beautiful hymns that we still sing today, and just really brought together this beautiful idea of intellectual and really spiritual just devotion. But he was preoccupied with really one important thing: truth. He has, of course, lots of things on his list, first among them God, but God is truth. So how can, in his time, let's focus on Augustine, let's focus on Western, what we call Western thought, exclude all the rest of this stuff. We don't know where it came from. It certainly isn't from our tradition, and it's not from clearly St. Augustine kind of lineage or the early church fathers, whether it was from the East or wherever it came from. But St. Thomas was, well, wait a minute. Truth is truth. So he really wanted to bring about, for example, Aristotelian thought, this kind of non-Christian based thought, if it was truth, and bring it all together. And of course, he did that in a wonderful way. But that was shocking to his contemporaries, called a heretic for even trying to do it. But he did a wonderful job of bringing together and saying, you know, truth is truth. And there is no discrepancy. I'll use our modern terms. There is no difference. There is no gap. There is no problem with faith and reason. They go together. They must go together. Beautiful kind of example of that is just saying that, you know what, we're body and soul. We don't go to heaven just one or the other alone. It's our bodies we have to fight with on earth, right? And our souls are with us. They all are tied together. That's not St. Thomas wording, but that's the idea. And so this idea that somehow our reasoning would be separate. Now, in Thomas's time, there were many people that thought, my reasoning is how I get to heaven. I'm going to be only those who are smart enough to really dig in. Secret knowledge, special knowledge, that's kind of resurfaced as a heresy over time. That's what's going to get, I got to do that work. I got to be smart. But that's not true at all. But our wisdom, our intelligence, our mind, our hearts all go together. They can be wrapped together, and that's what we're supposed to use. We don't have to be intellectuals to respond to the love of God. But if we have a gift, we should be using it in whatever capacity that is. And he wrote about capacity. He wrote about ability. Teleology is one of the fancy words. It's an end. We have an end. Our bodies have an end. Our souls have an end. Everything has a goal, an end, a purpose. And it must be drawn to that purpose. And we're given the ability and the capability to fulfill that purpose. But that's from God. That's by God. And it all works together. So he did a wonderful job. Let me give you the fancy description. Thomas Aquinas brought all the elements of the Trinitarian theologies of his predecessors into a metaphysical synthesis consonant with this Aristotelian philosophy. That's the fancy way of saying what I told you. He wanted truth to be really something that everybody saw. Truth is truth. But he admitted, and he knew, and he wrote about this extensively, that there are limits to what we can understand. So if there is a problem, a discrepancy, if one thing doesn't seem to match another, there's a limit, there's a problem. Maybe it's a problem of understanding. Maybe it's a problem of lack of information. But more than likely, it's a limitation of our human mind. We can't understand the very essence of God, the very nature of God. But we can see God's effects in the world. We can see the impact that it's had. We can see the way he loves us and shows us that. And we can kind of backstep and see working backwards and understand and learn more and more about God. But ultimately, there's a limit. Our intelligence, a finite intelligence, cannot understand the fullness of the infinite beauty of God. And that's where God steps in. Revelation, Scripture mainly, but in other ways. Revelation, God tells us about himself. He tells us those things we couldn't have reasoned out. There is no conflict between faith and reason. Intellect should be a part of what we do and helps to lead us to faith that leads us to God. And where we fail, where we stumble, where we have difficulties, God comes and helps and reveals himself to us. In the Summa in seminary, we weren't required to read this. You know, the interesting part of the Summa is it's a 5-volume set, and this is small print and very compact. We weren't required to read it, but this was the beginning of theological studies for example, seminarians or university students. This would have been the beginning, the very first class would have been, here you go. And this isn't even in modern times what most intellectuals even try to absorb, let alone seminarians with their busy schedule. You know, I saw one guy, I had the set and I was reading it, and we had assignments, we had to dig into it, portions of it. Beautiful in depth. I'd love to have that desire and energy to read through and really know all these things that St. Thomas talked about. But I saw other students with a summary of the Summa. Summary of the Summa. It was still like that thick. I even saw one student with a summary of the Summa. Well, you know, limited time, limited chance to sleep the seminarians have. It's kind of a shame, but, you know, we live in a time when we say, no, faith and reason should be separate. There's a big gap there. There's a problem. You believe, you have that part, but that goes against science, all that. That is not true at all, and St. Thomas was refuting that 800 years ago. I run across, you know, whether it's online or people talking to me, and they think they've come up with a wonderful, beautiful, interesting idea of why they don't have to come to church, why they don't have to commit to anything, why they don't have to be a part of anything in their community, why they can do whatever they want without consequences. And they make this argument, and I'm like, you know what? St. Thomas wrote about this 800 years ago, and he did a better job than you're doing about it. Why? Because in the Summa, very interesting time and age that St. Thomas lived in, you wrote what you believe, that assertion. And then you said why people believe the different views of it, and you discard these other pieces. And then, this beautiful part that I love, you try to combat against your own argument with the best arguments against it that you can. You try to out-argument yourself. And so you have these arguments. Well, people say that that's not true, or this can't happen, or that it's like this instead of that. And he argued each one of those and then picked each one of those apart, leaving us with the beautiful core of his teaching. So again, a beautiful thing. I encourage you to read it. I won't get into it too much. This is a weekday homily. I've already gone too far. Let me just read to you really quickly an outline of one question about the Trinity. First, St. Thomas speaks about the persons of the Trinity absolutely, and then he compares them. Then and he used the term person, so then he has to define what person means. And then he talks about the number of persons, 3 of course. And then he talks about what's involved in the number of the persons, why 3? Then he talks about what's involved in the knowledge of those persons and of each other. Then he talks about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Then he speaks of the relationships to their essence, and then to their properties, and then to their notional acts. And then he compares them to one another. And then he does that in equality and then in likeness to each other. And then in regards to their mission. And then in relation to the creature versus creator. And then their accents, their properties. And then he speaks in God, relation. The relationship in the Trinity is substantial, a source, a cause, unlike an attribute in human nature. So that's just the outline of one question in the hundreds that are in the Summa. Don't let someone tell you our faith is weak intellectually. Don't let them tell you faith and reason don't go together. Don't let them tell you truth is true for me and not for you. Truth is what I think. That is error. That is heresy. St. Thomas speaks to that eloquently. You don't have to read the Summa to know. Everything, not everything, almost everything that we really deal with on a theological basis is somehow rooted in St. Thomas 800 years ago. Now, having said that, he tried to root his knowledge in the church fathers and others coming forward, but also truth is truth. So, before I go on the rest of the day about St. Thomas, just know you have a beauty in the depth of the gifts that we've been given, this deposit of faith. St. Thomas is only one, not just intellectual, not just from the heart. That man who resisted temptations brought about by his own family to sway him from his path towards God, that man who spent his life intellectually trying to help people understand the beauty and depth of God, that man who wrote beautiful hymns because he had a heart for God, not just a mind for God, when he had a mystical experience at the end of his life, he said everything he had done was as straw compared to the glory of God. That's something that you have as a gift, a treasure that you have in our faith. Let it be something to inspire you today. And my apologies for an extra long homily.